Hello, and welcome to Discovery, conversations about the power of the arts to connect us to each other and to place. I'm Koven Smith, Senior Director of Arts at the Knight Foundation. For today's conversation, we'll be unpacking the ethics of for-profit technology when used within arts organizations. Joining me today is the legendary Adriel Luis. Adriel is a community organizer, artist, writer, and curator who believes that collective liberation can happen in poetic ways. His life's work is focused on the mutual thriving of artistic integrity and social vigilance. As a self-professed lover of the internet, his work traces a straight line from customizing his AOL profile with Jodeci lyrics all the way through to his appointment as the first digital curator at the Smithsonian. And Adriel is the curator of digital and practice at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, where he advocates for equitable practices in museums and institutions. His ancestors are rooted in Toisan, China, and migrated through Hong Kong, Mexico, and the United States, and he was born on Ohlone land. We want you to be active participants in the conversation, so if you have questions, please submit them throughout the show via Twitter using the hashtag #NightLive and in the comments section of the live stream. We will try to get to as many of them as we can throughout the conversation. Adriel, welcome to Discovery. Thank you so much for being here.
What's up, Koven? So good to see you. So
It's
excited.
so good to see you too.
I know.
Well, let's just, I think, start with some background and kind of how how you got to how to us being here talking right now. So you had already been an active participant in the internet for years before you became a curator at APAC, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe how your relationship to the internet and with the internet has changed over the years.
Yeah. Thank you, Koven, for having me and Knight Foundation, and hello, everybody tuning in from the different channels and platforms. So I'm currently living out here in Sangna, which is Tongva, Gabrielino, Quiche, and Chumash land. And out here, so one of the shows that I've been like loving during this pandemic is called City of Ghosts, and it goes through different parts of Los Angeles, which is what we call it out here these days, and really talks about the deep history. And there's one that focuses on Tongva history, and one of the things that really spoke to me that I recognized in that, as I've been learning about the history of LA after living here for a little bit over a year, is this notion of interconnectedness, this idea that life permeates through everything around us, not just sort of the sentient beings, the plants and the animals, but also the minerals, the waterways. It's really this networked existence, and I think one of the reasons why the internet has always spoken to me has been for those same reasons of feeling like there's life out there, even when I'm alone. And I know that specifically during this pandemic time, that's been something that's been a challenge for a lot of us, but has also been really life-giving. Um, I came online back when I was really young. My dad's a computer engineer, and so I grew up in the Bay Area, kind of that Silicon Valley sort of life with a PC in my living room ever since I was a kid, back before the internet was all the glory that it is today. I remember checking my email on Juno, where it would like log in, grab your email, and then log you off because otherwise it's too expensive. You can't luxuriate while reading your email while being online, right? And so then when I was able to actually get on AOL, and I think first it was like Prodigy and then AOL,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and then getting into internet forums like Tripod, GeoCities, the blog rings, and then onto social media like Asian Avenue and Zanga, LiveJournal, and then Friendster, and then eventually the big dogs. What's really strung me along the entire time has been this idea that a community can be built. And I think especially for someone growing up where I didn't quite feel like I fit in exactly in all the right ways in school, the internet was really this alternative platform for me.
Well, and that's so interesting. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, do you feel that your sense of interconnectedness has changed as the nature of the sort of structure of the internet, and as has come to be dominated by a handful of, major players? Like, has that
Mhm.
sort of changed your thinking on it? As
Mhm.
I'll stop there.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that uh, the sort of reflex is, especially for my personality, the reflex is to be like, oh, now everyone's in the pool. The water was so nice before. Like I think one of the reasons why I love the internet was because and is continues to be because of just the nuance that you can find. Like one of my favorite things to do in high school was find underground hip hop artists, like on websites where they were playing, where you could find music that they weren't playing on the radio, right? And then eventually Napster really sort of uh,
Mhm.
brought to realization how much I love that. And I think that today in curating work and finding artists that people en masse haven't heard of yet, and kind of like sharing that with the world is really what I've loved. I always viewed it as a hobby. I think that as the internet began to dominate our attention and become the primary way where so many of us find our information, it really made me kind of double down on finding that nuance. And at the same time, helped me realize that I mean, I don't really like using the word expertise necessarily, but definitely there's like a level of just sort of experience, like in seeing the growth of the internet, really actually seeing the internet sort of come into its become an institution. I feel like when I
Yeah,
first logged on, like in the late 90s, I don't think any of us would have referred to the internet as an institution. It was just kind of like this
yeah.
weird thing that the nerds would go on. And but now there is a lot of potential for leadership for those of us who have experienced the internet in really intimate ways and have existed on it, as users, as webmasters, as social media coordinators. These are all different hats that we wear on the same platform that provide the sort of breadth that I think for folks who maybe have always viewed themselves as passive internet users, maybe haven't really identified with that leadership role the way that I have,
Hmm.
and that I know that you have as well, Koven.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's this interesting moment that we're in where, in a certain sense, these larger platforms have, in a strange way, fulfilled this notion of, oh, we can all be creators and we can all be participants. And yet there's something about the present moment that, even with full realization of that, that still feels strangely passive. And, I know we'll
Mm,
get into this a little bit later, and about sort of the ways in which these platforms sort of railroad us into certain ethical directions, and not in others. But I think
mhm,
it is an interesting moment, and especially for both of us, transitioning from it being a hobby to effectively being our livelihoods for one way or another. But so,
mhm, mhm.
to just to follow on that, I want to talk a little bit about the paper that you presented yesterday. So, yesterday you presented at the Collective Liberation Conference, which was an equity coalition convening facilitated by, I'm going to read this because I don't want to miss any of these names, but facilitated by Museums and Race, Mass Action, Museum Workers Speak, Hooray, Death to Museums, The Inclusium, Museums Are Not Neutral, The Empathetic Museum, and Visitors of Color. And the paper, Bigger Than the Internet, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and just sort of what the response was to it yesterday when you presented.
Yeah, sure. So we're tuning in on June 3rd, so this dropped on June 2nd, for those tuning in later on. And Bigger Than the Internet is I what do you call it? Like an internet essay? It's a blog post, a research paper, a bunch of personal entries, journal entries. I mean, one of the things I love about the internet is the fact that these genres just sort of melt away.
Right.
I originally wrote it when I was invited to publish something for the Journal of Museum Education, and as I began writing it, um, I started doing a deep dive into sort of like memory lane of the internet and my life around it. Like I played with Mario Teaches Typing, which you can still find as like a widget online. And then also was reading a lot of like early internet like e-journals and things like that. Um, and so that really, and then also reading a lot of decolonial texts like Linda Tuhiwai Smith and decolonizing methodologies, Lana Lopez's, False Divides, these works that really blend personal narrative with research. And so I wanted to write it in that way as an homage to them and also as an homage to my life on the internet. And the reason why those two come together is because this paper is about really how do we claim agency over our use of the internet and our ability to use the internet, particularly if we're working with or from cultural institutions. I wanted to go all the way back to the beginning of how and why museums were founded, which there's no denying the colonial history of museums when they were initially established, especially in parts of the global South and in the non-Western world. And then also the beginnings of the internet, which is very much around this idea of collective liberation and free exchange of knowledge. In a lot of ways, the polar opposite of how museums were initially established, sort of as these like mouthpieces for empire. And so this paper really sort of meets us where we are today, where the internet and museums are intertwined. So much of how museums reach people, even prior to the pandemic, was via the internet. But also, the internet is such a different place than it was, like in the era that we were just talking about, Koven. And so, now with museums talking about decolonization, about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, all these kind of like flashy new sort of synonyms of like diversity, right? Like how do we really own that in a way where we don't just let it get watered down the way that terms like diversity and tolerance and terms that were very radical when they first came out the gate. Like how do we make sure that a term like decolonization, for example, which means something very specific and something very direct, doesn't get co-opted, whether that be on purpose or not, through kind of vague interpretations in ways that are still conducive to museums and institutions continuing forward, kind of claiming inclusion, but not really changing their ways. And the main thing that this paper focuses on is the use of online platforms by way of museums, and just calling attention to what we're doing when we are asking people in our community or our visitors to spend that extra 5, 10, 30 seconds on Facebook, knowing that it's actively gathering data, actively surveilling people, and actively sending it to marketers, governments, and shady characters, right? So just really paying deep attention to the fact that we are doing that, we are implicated in that, it's tied to a deep history of colonization. So what do we do moving forward?
So do you see that as a sort of fundamental tension in the sense that museums being museums, there's a tendency to want to sort of institutionalize processes like decolonization and say sort of, well, we have a department that handles that. And we are NAGPRA compliant and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, and we haven't collected anything. All of our work is 20th century work, and therefore, this is not even a thing that we have to address. But I think what you're talking about that's so fascinating is this idea of decolonization as a practice that really filters down across departments and across, personnel, but then really thinking about how it manifests in other ways that we are potentially subjecting our visitors to more modern colonial processes. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so for example, I quote the scholar Jolid Seed Pihama, who talks about how decolonization isn't just recognizing that colonization has existed and being like admitting that that was bad, right? It also means unraveling current existing structures, right? And so, for example, and another sort of hot term that's kind of come up, shout out to Adrienne Marie Brown, is emergent strategy. And we're seeing institutions and big machines start adopting terms like that as well. So when we think about emergent strategy, but then it's being represented through these very traditional looking Venn diagrams and charts, and people are talking about uh, let's focus on decolonization, but make sure that we still retain the same metrics of success around getting as many hits as possible and scaling up and like getting visitor eyes or all these things that really are also coming from colonial roots. Then we have to stop and ask ourselves, where is the decolonization? Are we just kind of saying that, well, now we have more Twitter handles in our chat that represent people of color, so therefore now we've decolonized, therefore now we've diversified? Or are we really ingesting and processing and recognizing the interconnectedness and really the benefits of diversifying, which is not just seeing, like a different range of faces, but really also hearing the different ways of knowing and the different experiences and also the different visions and frameworks of going about things, different ways of understanding what success is and isn't.
Hmm. Well, and actually, that's related to a question that came to us from the audience, which, if you don't mind, I'll ask that. Which is, it says, now that museums have shown interest in decolonization, do you think they can stop relying on the internet and instead pursue that avenue in a way that creates fewer ethical dilemmas?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I mean, that framing of like relying on the internet, because I mean,
Like, is that even a possible thing, I guess, at
we
this
rely
point?
on the internet no matter what, like if you want to, even if you want to go cash only, like at some point you've got to pull it at the ATM, I guess, or buy the mattress on Casper.com so that you can hide your cash underneath it. I don't know, like so much of our lives rely on the internet. And so, but I guess like maybe one of the sort of baseline questions and, going back to your question of how this paper was received yesterday, you know, uh, collective liberation is, in a very kind of like in the fashion of how I love the internet. It's sort of like uh, a, 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 a collective of different groups of people that aren't even necessarily organizations. Some of them are nonprofit organizations, but some of them are collectives that are formed through affinity. They're affinity groups, but they came together to basically provide an alternative convening to the American Alliance of Museums conference, which is sort of the more formal museum gathering that's happening this month. And so when one of the things that we were kind of just thinking through, and one of the things I proposed in the paper is not necessarily like take your museum or your institution off of Facebook or Twitter, but at least dare to imagine, what it would be like. Like take a staff meeting and think through that, and feel it, like feel how that feels, like it may, and if part of the conversation is like, oh well, we can't do that, then even that is useful knowledge. It's like, we really can't do that, and so I think I would say that as opposed to thinking in such a broad stroke as like to stop relying on the internet, think about maybe what are the plugs in the internet that you personally or organizationally are involved in that you don't feel all the way great about, right? Uh, when I talk to people, for example, about, like, oh, I'm thinking about getting off Facebook, right? And then usually the response is like, well, I can't do that because, I talk to my family through this, or I can't do that because there's this incredible Facebook group where I get a lot of stuff out of it, right? Like there are these curatorial forums that I was getting a lot out of, but that I decided weren't worth me being on Facebook when I got off of Facebook a couple of years ago. Um, and it wasn't that I felt like, those forums weren't good enough. It was just that, at a certain point, I also recognize that like the longer I'm on these platforms and the more content that I'm sort of like helping regurgitate through Facebook, I might end up being that one person or one of part of that handful of people that someone else stays on Facebook for. Like I would at this point, I don't want to be the person, where someone's like, well, I would get off of Facebook, but I just love Adriel's posts, so I'm just going to stay on this platform and let them keep on gathering my information. I'd feel terrible about that, right? And so same thing with your organization and your institution. Like as a collective, all of us together are staying on these platforms, and then so there are people out there who would be like, well, I just love the Smithsonian's content, so I'm going to stay on this platform, right? And that's great if we're all about that platform, but if we're not, let's have a conversation about it. And if we don't know because we haven't talked about it because it might be considered political, then let's think about the fact that we've now considered addressing privacy issues on Facebook as a quote political issue that is now in the same realm as like talking about presidential campaigns and things that I know a lot of us nonprofits actually can't take a position on. Like this question of neutrality that Latanya Autry and Mike Morawski talks about. And institutions that claim to be neutral, oftentimes we get this word politics confused, right? I do think that for an institution like the Smithsonian, which is connected with the government, it's important for us to not sort of prescribe opinions about certain politics, right? But when it comes to us, the internet, which is described as a town square, and Facebook and Google, which are described as public resources, if they aren't serving our public or if they're harming our public, then as institutions of knowledge and understanding of how we go about the world and the universe, I think it's critically important for us to have direct and candid conversations about them, as opposed to just kind of like going along for the ride and like, oh, Cambridge Analytica happened, but it's National Cheese Day, so we'll just like post about that instead.
Well, so I mean, to that point, I think and your paper gets into this a little bit, but I wonder if some of the issue here, and especially in terms of museums trying to negotiate what their relationships with these platforms might look like, or arts organizations in general, is that that negotiation has largely taken place on the level of kind of functionality, which is like, does this platform do what I need it to do? Does it format image captions the way I like? And therefore, I'm going to turn a blind eye. I'm just going to sort of not even think about what other things that platform may do that I don't want to know about. And in your paper, you talk about sort of negotiating that relationship more on an ethic level, which I feel like is an important stepping stone for a lot of institutions that really still, are often coming to these platforms more from a place of, quite frankly, guilt than anything else. Is well, everybody else is on this platform. The Smithsonian is on Facebook, so probably we should be too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as opposed to sort of negotiating that at a more at a deeper level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the Smithsonian and so many institutions, not just museums either, like any and now it can get even more confusing because like even brands, like are sort of taking on the mantle of being like, well, we're also about, uh, we're also public servants, like Nabisco is a public servant and stands for diversity, right? And so it's like, okay, you know, if if you don't claim that, then in some ways you're a bit off the hook, um, but so many institutions, so many corporations have now claimed to be for community. So as someone who came up in community and whose life work is about community, my question would be, well, show me your receipts, right? It's the same thing as like if I started claiming to be an environmental justice advocate, because I started recycling, right? Then there's, rightfully, there's going to be people who have been doing the work for a long time, who are asking, well, what are your qualifications, And so I think that when it comes to these institutions, we have to recognize that, the public who does take seriously the fact that we are for community isn't just looking at us based on what we're saying, but how we're saying it, not just what we're doing, but how we're doing it. And when it comes to a museum, for example, it's not just what we're putting up in our exhibitions, but how did these exhibitions come about, and I think that that's something that um, people are asking more and more these days, especially because institutions are claiming to be for community. And so it's like, well, if we have these things in our display cases, let's also have an understanding of how these came about. And then same thing, like in the future, when we look back and look at all this content that we've posted on these platforms, part of it will be the provenance. How did these eyes land on this post? Who was harmed? What was taken? What was the cost? Right. In my paper, I talk about the Wilkes expedition in the mid 1800s, which is the expedition where the beginning of the Smithsonian collection, what was procured, right, all throughout the Pacific. Some through very peaceful ways and some through very not. There's a point where I talk about how Wilkes was going through collecting seabirds, which are still in the anthropological archives, or I'm sorry, in the birds archives, and he just went around smacking them in the head, and and then just taking the bodies back, right? And so it sounds like, well, yeah, we would never approve of that now, but that sort of extractive method, at the time he was just like, I'm out to get information. This is how I get it, right? And so I think now, it's the same thing when we're looking at Facebook, Twitter, these other platforms where it's like our job is to get the message out to the public, and here's the tools. So here's how we're going to do it, right? And if we don't actually ask about the cost, right, it's quite similar to sort of that method of fishing where you're just kind of like, you just take some claws and a net and you just scrape the ocean floor, and then you pluck out all the things that you want from it, and then you don't care about the rest of it, right? There's so many similarities between that sort of method of data and information extraction and what's happening on the internet.
Well, Adriel, as usual, I would love to keep talking for about 4 more hours. And we have about 2 minutes left and many questions from the audience.
Cans of worms.
Yeah. So question from the audience, we'll try and get through as many of these as we can, but do you think the internet's nature of moving through trends quickly is contributing to the watering down of these important issues? Or do you think this was a problem before the internet came around?
No, that's a good question. No, I think the internet has sort of coaxed institutions to think rapidly for better or worse. There's a lot of good, like, for example, the Smithsonian has begun, making statements in direct response to things happening in society. For example, I worked with my team at the Asian Pacific American Center on a response to the Atlanta shootings. There was a response to police violence against Black folks in the U.S. I think it's important for institutions to be able to respond quickly, as opposed to be like, well, I'll just wait this through for 7 years and then sort of post a retrospective exhibition on it. But at the same time, I think that it's important to recognize what institutions are here for. Institutions are here to respond mindfully. And that doesn't always mean that it has to happen slowly, but it does mean that it has to happen mindfully and thoughtfully, right? And so if the goal is to respond quickly but also thoughtfully, then I think that that's a practice. It's a skill that requires honing, and those of us who have been publishing on the internet, whether it's been blogs or tweets or whatever, a lot of us have practiced that. Like we've all tweeted something way too fast and then recognized that maybe that wasn't the best thing, you know. And I think one of the ways that institutions can take a step towards recognizing that is by treating the people who run their social media accounts with the stakes that they deserve. You know, like if you treat social media as an entry-level position, you know, then you're not necessarily getting the expertise of somebody who has been through the trial and error, has sort of felt the pain and the triumph of tweeting the right or wrong thing. You know, I think that those are all important things for institutions to be able to process. You know, but at the end of the day, what makes institutions different from like startup companies is that we're supposed to last. You know, like the Long Now Foundation, you know, they describe institutions, the value of institutions as these entities that have a longer lifespan than the average human being, right? And then so there's a level of wisdom that we have access to. You know, as the Smithsonian, for example, being around for 175 years. No one's lived that long, but there's a memory that exists in this institution that doesn't exist with Google. It doesn't exist with Facebook. And so as opposed to trying to feel like we've got to jump into the same hot tub as all these startups because they're the ones who are getting all the followers on their own platforms, you know, we can also recognize the long view that we have and really wield that. I think right now that's one of the best things we can do for the public is one of the things that's really missing in a lot of the dialogues that we're having.
Well, Adriel, sadly, we're going to have to end there, but that seems like a wonderful place to end. And I strongly encourage those who are tuning in to read Adriel's paper. It's posted in the show notes. It's called "Bigger Than the Internet." It's maybe one of the best things I've read about museums in many years. It's wonderful. It's a great read.
Wow,
You'll love it.
that means a
Read it to
lot.
the kids at night. And so,
yeah,
so
I'll post a parental explicit advisory version.
well, so Adriel, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you coming down and talking to us and everyone here. And special thanks here to the production crew. And just as we're wrapping up here, I'll say bye, Adriel, and then I'll do my wrap up here. But the beats at the top of our show were created by a former Night colleague, Chris Barr, and the music that will play us out is composed and performed by the amazing Akron Jazz pianist Theron Brown. Tune in next week on Night Live for a conversation between Amy Mitchell, Director of Journalism Research at the Pew Research Center, and John Sands, Director for Learning and Impact at the Knight Foundation, for a conversation on public opinion and media research in the digital age on the future of democracy, the Knight Foundation show about trends, ideas, and disruptions changing the face of our democracy. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.